We're talking about factoring with greatest common factor in quadratic form. And in this case, we have to do the greatest common factor and quadratic form together. Whenever we want to factor using the quadratic form of ax squared plus bx plus c, we always want to try to have our lead coefficient that is equal to 1. So in this case, we want to try to factor a 4 out. So we want to try to take a 4 out of each one of these three terms. We also want to make sure that we have a lead coefficient that's positive. So the goal is to have it be positive and to be 1. So 4x squared divided by 4, we bring the 4 out front of our parentheses, and 4 divided by 4 is 1, so that just leaves us with x squared. Next up, we have negative 28x divided by 4. We don't have an x, so the x will stay. That will be our linear term. And negative 28 divided by 4 is negative 7. And then the last one is negative 72 divided by 4, and that is 18. Okay, so first part, we did the greatest common factor, and we factored out a 4. So that was our GCF. And now we have a lead coefficient that is 1 and positive. So now we can work on the quadratic form part. And from there, again, we need to have two numbers that multiply to 18 and add, or multiply to negative 18 and add to negative 7. So they need to add to negative 7, but also multiply to negative 18. So there's numbers that we know, right? We could use 18 and 1. We could use 3 and 6. But if we think about it, 3 plus 6 is not going to add to negative 7. So the one that we need to check is we need to check 9 and 2. Now, 9 times 2 is 18, but we know that we have a negative. So one of these has to be negative. And we also know that it needs to add to negative 7. So we need the larger number to match whatever sign this is. So in this case, it's negative. The larger number is 9. So the 9 has to match. The sign in front of the 9 has to match the sign in front of the 7 in order for that to take place. And we can check it. Negative 9 times 2 is negative 18. Negative 9 plus 2 is negative 7. So then we found what those are. And then we can substitute those in. So we can rewrite this. So we keep the 4 out front because that has to be there because we factored it out. And now we can write down our binomial. The two terms that multiply together to get x squared, that is always, in this case, is going to be x and x because we have a lead coefficient of 1. And then we have a minus 9 and a plus 2. So minus 9 and then plus 2. So this is the answer that we're looking for right here. And then we can check it to make sure that that's what we wanted to get. And the first way that we check it is we could multiply the binomials together. So x times x is x squared. X times 2 is positive 2x. Negative 9 times x is negative 9x. And negative 9 times 2 is negative 18. In this case, we have to make sure we keep the 4 out front. And then we can combine like terms. So when we combine like terms, we get 4x squared minus 7x minus 18. And then the last step, we can distribute the 4 back in. Uh, 4 times x squared is 4x squared. 4 times negative 7x is negative 28x. And 4 times negative 18 is negative 72. And so our new checked equation matches what we started with. So then our factored form is 4x minus 9 times x plus 2. We can take a look at number 6. And it kind of looks like this is ready to go, but it's not quite, because our lead term here is negative. So what we need to do really is we need to factor out a negative 1. So we're going to basically just change the sign of all these. So we take that negative 1 out of everything, so the negative 1 stays out front. And all we're going to do is change the sign. So it becomes r squared minus 11r plus 10. So then we know that we have to have two numbers that multiply to 10, multiply to positive 10, and add to negative 11. Okay, so when we do that, and we know that we have numbers like 5 times 2, but if we think about 5 plus 2, that only gets us to 7. We need to get to 11. So what's the other option? 10 and 1. So 10 times 1. 10 times 1, if we multiply those together, is 10. And 10 plus 1 is 11. So the issue is we have the wrong sign. So what we have to do is we just make these both negative. Negative times a negative is still a positive. Add them together is still negative. So those are the terms that we need to have. So we continue to write this, and we have the negative 1 out front. And the only thing that we can get together to make sure that our binomial works is for r here is it has to be r times r. R times r becomes r squared. And then we already figured out that it's negative 10 and negative 1. And then we can do a check again. We can always do our check, but this is our solution, and we can just check it. So again, we'll distribute. R times r is r squared. R times negative 1 is negative 1r. Negative 10 times r is negative 10r. And negative 10 times negative 1 is positive 10. So that's all set, but we still have the negative 1 there. Then we can combine like terms. So we get negative 1 r squared, negative 1r minus 10r is negative 11r and plus 10. And then the last step in the process to check, we just distribute the negative 1 to all the parts. So basically we're just changing the sign. And we get negative r squared plus 11r minus 10. And then we see that our checked equation matches what we had originally. So then this is the factored form.